Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We're learning Mishnah Beitza, Parak Aleph, Chapter 1, Mishnah Vav, Mishnah 6. Okay. Beis Shammai Oimrim. Beis Shammai say, another argument between Beis Shammai, the Academy of Shammai, and the Academy of Hillel. Beis Shammai Oimrim, Beis Shammai say like this: Ein Meilichin Chala Matanas L'Koyim B'Yom Tiv. One cannot bring the challah separation and the gifts to a kohen on Yom Tiv, bein shehurmu me'emesh, whether they were separated from the day before, meaning from the day before Yom Tiv, bein shehurmu me'hayom, where they were separated today. Okay, now we know that when from our new produce, we give a separation called the truma to a kohen. There is also an obligation that when you make a dough, that you separate from the dough challah. We use the word challah to talk about the bread in general, but challah is actually a term used for the separation of the dough that we're supposed to give to a kohen. And nowadays, when we give it to a kohen, we burn it. But whenever you make a dough of a certain size, every time you make a new dough, there's a separation of it that has to be separated for the kohen. That's referring to when we say challah. Matanas gifts is the words that use that when you slaughter an animal, there are certain parts of an animal that are supposed to go to a kohen. Those parts the Torah calls the zeroah, which means the right foreleg, l'chayayim, the jaws, the keva, they call it the maw, one of the stomachs. So after you slaughter a regular animal, not talking about a carbon or anything like that, talking about a regular animal, those parts have to be removed and given to a kohen. Okay, now, in this case, the Beis Shammai is saying like this: you've got challah and you've got the gifts, and you want to bring it to the kohen because that's where it's supposed to go, and you want to do it on Yom Tiv. Beis Shammai say you can't, and you can't do it whether these gifts were separated yesterday, erev Yom Tiv, or even today. Meaning, on Yom Tiv, you're allowed to separate these things. You can separate challah on Yom Tiv. You can go ahead and you can separate. You can separate challah on Yom Tiv, and you could also separate these parts of the animal that are supposed to the kohen on Yom Tiv. You can do that. But Beis Shammai say, but you can't bring it to him. You can't give it to him on Yom Tiv. And it makes no difference whether the challah was separated or the parts were separated from the animal from before Yom Tiv or on Yom Tiv. Now, we have to read through the Mishnah before we start explaining the reasoning behind everything. Beis Hillel matirin. Beis Hillel say it's permissible. You can bring it on Yom Tiv to him. Amar lahem Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai said to them, they said to Beis Hillel, Gazei Reshava. In this case, Gazei Reshava doesn't mean what it usually means about a common word between two things, but it means they're comparable. Chalo umatanas umatana matana l'kayin. I'm going to say chalo umatanas matana l'kayin. The challah separation and the gifts of the animal are a gift to a kohen. Uchruma matana l'kayin, and shruma, what we separate from the grain for the kohen, is also a gift for the kohen. So therefore, kashem shen malichnes hatruma, the same way that we cannot give truma to a kohen on Yom Tiv, kach ein malichnes hamatana, so too you cannot give him the gifts. Beis Shammai is saying to Beis Hillel, you agree that you cannot bring truma to a kohen on Yom Tiv. Now, truma. And as we're going to see, truma can only be separated before Yom Tiv. So you agree, Beis Shammai say to Beis Hillel, you agree that truma that was separated before Yom Tiv, you cannot bring to the kohen on Yom Tiv. And the same way you can't do that for that gift to the kohen, you cannot do it either for the other gifts to the kohen, referring to challah and the matanas and the gifts from the animal. Amar lahem Beis Hillel. So Beis Hillel said to them, nope, not a comparison. Im amartem b'truma, what you say by truma that you can't give it to the kohen on Yom Tiv, shenazaka baramasa, you're not permitted to separate it on Yom Tiv. You can't separate truma on Yom Tiv. Can't. We'll explain why soon. So Beis Hillel say by truma where you can't separate it on Yom Tiv, you can't bring it to him on Yom Tiv. Tamar matanis, but what will you say by matanis, by the gifts, shazaka baramasan, that you could separate them on Yom Tiv. The chal you can separate on Yom Tiv, and the gifts you can separate on Yom Tiv. So the wording of the Mishnah is basically say by Truma where you can't separate it on Yontif, you can't give it to him on Yontif. Challah and the gifts that you could separate on Yontif, you can give to him on Yontif. Okay, so we have these words in the Mishnah that aren't very, what exactly is the understanding and the argument here that's going on. So here we go. Now, the first thing is like this, because we have to distinguish between challah and truma, challah and matanas and the gifts and truma. So the first thing we have to establish about truma is like this: one does not become obligated to separate truma until the final stages of processing the produce have been completed. We're talking about a farmer here. We're talking about the grain that he just harvested. The obligation to separate truma from this pile only happens at the conclusion of the processing of the wheat, which is, in the case of grain, these include threshing the stalks to remove the kernels, heaping the kernels into a pile, and smoothing out the pile. That's the completion of the processing. You thresh it, you pile it up, you smooth it off on top. Now it's completed, and now we say you have to separate the grain. You have to separate the truma from the grain. At this point, it becomes what's called tevel. You're not allowed to eat it. Activities of this type are typically done before Yontif. You can't thresh on Yontif, right? You don't do these things on Yontif because they are prohibited on Yontif. You're not allowed to do it on Yontif. In the standard course of events, therefore, the obligation to separate truma takes effect before Yontif. That's step number one you got to bear in mind. Being that you cannot process the grain on Yontif, it has to be done before Yontif. The obligation to separate is going to take effect before Yontif. So that's step number one. Step number two, the Torah prohibits eating produce from which truma has not yet been separated. Meaning after this point of time, the Torah already prohibits you from eating from it. The Rabbanan forbid you even before to have a meal from it. You can snack from it, give it to your animal. But the Torah prohibits eating produce which truma has not yet been separated after the completion of the processing. Thus, the act of separating truma makes the produce fit to be eaten. You don't separate truma, you're not allowed to eat it. Separating truma thus resembles the biblically prohibited malacha of repairing a utensil, which makes the utensil to be used. Torah says you can't fix something on Shabbos or on Yontif, something that can't be used. Now you want to fix it, you can't do that. So too, when you go ahead and you fix your food, so to speak, it resembles that. Given this resemblance, the sages forbade separating truma on Yontif. Can't separate it on Yontif. You're like fixing. That's a rabbinic prohibition. Furthermore, they forbade giving truma to a kohen on Yontif, for if giving were permitted, people might mistakenly assume that even separating is permitted. Meaning, let's say it was already separated before Yontif. I want to give it on Yontif. What's wrong with that? The answer is the sages were cautious. They were concerned with what people might make a mistake and think that if I can give the truma on Yontif, I could actually separate it on Yontif. And therefore, the Chachamim said, not only can't you separate the truma on Yontif or Shabbos, you cannot give it to the Kohen on Shabbos or Yontif. Okay? That's step number one regarding truma. Now, another thing they add is like this, and this is important to know because of the contrast to the chal and the gifts. If, let's say, the situation would have been that it's impossible to separate truma before Yontif. Let's say you couldn't do it, which is typically not the case. But let's say you couldn't have done it before Yontif. Okay, so I can't do it before Yontif, and now it's Yontif. What should I do? Not eat? The Chachamim didn't want to do that to you. If it would have been impossible to separate the truma before Yontif, then the Chachamim would have allowed you to separate it on Yontif. They would have suspended that prohibition. And if it would have been impossible to separate the truma before Yontif, then you would have gone. Then the Chachamim allowed you to separate it on Yontif. However, since it is possible to separate truma before Yontif, because the processing is to take care before Yontif, it's not going to happen on Yontif. So therefore, the prohibition of separating truma was left in place. It's another point to bear in mind. So again, by truma, since it's typically going to be done before Yontif, because you can't do it on Yontif, you could have taken care of it on Yontif. Now, taking care means you could have separated it. That's all you need to do to fix your food. You got to separate it. You don't have to give it to the Kohen before you eat it. You separated it, you can eat your food. So separating you could have done before Yontif, because typically that's when the processing would be finished, and you could do it. Okay? So that's Truma. Truma is forbidden to separate on Shabbos and Yontif because it's like fixing. You cannot give it to the Kohen either on Shabbos and Yontif. And being that it's possible to have separated it before Yontif, which should have been possible, there is no way to suspend on Yontif the prohibition of separating Truma. Next. Now, let's talk about the challah, and let's talk about the gifts from the animal. What is allowed to wait until Yontif to knead dough and slaughter animals so that he will have fresh bread and meat to eat on Yontif? The rule is, even when it comes to food preparation, which is permitted on Yontif, even though it may not be permitted on Shabbos, if you could have made this preparation before Yontif with the same result you'd have before Yontif or after Yontif, there's no difference between before and after. You got to do it before. You're allowed to separate your challah and separate the animal parts on Yontif, because when should I have done it? Yesterday? I should have baked my bread yesterday. I should have slaughtered my animal yesterday. Fresh food is always better, and we want to enhance your joy of Yontif. So one is allowed to wait until Yontif to knead dough and slaughter animals so that he will have fresh bread and meat to eat on Yontif. In this case, at least, it is impossible to separate the challah and matanis before Yontif. Couldn't have done it before, because the obligation to separate them does not take effect until the dough is kneaded and the animal is slaughtered. For this reason, the age is permitted separating them on Yontif. That's logical, right? And since they are first separated on Yontif, they may also be given to a Kohen on Yontif. Why not? Right? What's the problem? Someone's going to think if you give it to the Kohen today, you could separate it today? You could. No problem. Now, how about, though, if they were separated yesterday? And I could have done it yesterday. How about that? A little bit different, right? It's a little bit different. And we'll see why. But it's a little bit, but we have a certain difference. Let's say you already separated the challah before Yontif, and you separated the animal parts before Yontif, and you could have given it to the kohen before Yontif. Well, not necessarily. Okay. So what about then? If you could have done it before Yontif, could you give it to him before Yontif? Could you give it to him on Yontif? So Beisil will say yes. Once the sage is permitted giving challah and matanis, in one case, meaning the case of where it was on Yontif, where the animal was slaughtered, the dough was kneaded on Yontif, they did not impose a prohibition against giving them in any case. Thus, giving challah and matanis to a kohen on Yontif is always permitted, even if they had already been separated the day before and could have been given then. Now, okay, so there seems to be a reason why, if I could have done it before Yontif, and I didn't it before Yontif, it should be different. Maybe if I could have done it before Yontif, I could have done it before Yontif. The challah was separated before Yontif. The animal parts were separated before Yontif. And I could have given it to him, and it was separated before Yontif. And I could have given it to him on Yontif. There seems to be a question or a possibility to say, if that's the case, you can't give it on Yontif. Beisil will say, no, once the Chachamim said you can do it, once it's for sure permissible in one case, which is when the dough was kneaded and the animal was slaughtered on Yontif, you can do it all the time. Now, what would be the reason to think otherwise? Like, what's the problem? If you give it to me on Yontif, if the problem is, if giving to him on Yontif is a problem to say, it would create a problem because people are going to think, I could do it on Yontif, I can do it on Yontif. I could do it on Yontif, can't I? Now, 1 minute. Beis Shammai ever take the opposite position. In their view, giving challah and matanis to a kohen on Yontif is always forbidden, even if the dough was kneaded and the animal was slaughtered on Yontif, in which case separating challah and matanis is permitted, giving them is prohibited. Beis Shammai say, even if you wanted your fresh bread and your freshly slaughtered meat, which allowed you to separate the challah on Yontif and to take the animal parts off on Yontif, you're allowed to do that. You cannot give it to him on that day. Why not? What's the problem? People are going to think you can do it that day. You could. The problem is like this. They were concerned that if people were to see challah and matanas being brought to a kohen on Yontif, they might mistakenly think that separating them on Yontif is permitted in all cases, even where they could have been separated the day before. Meaning, the halacha is that if, let's say I could have separated the dough the day before, I could have separated the animal parts the day before. I could have done it before. I didn't. I didn't even separate it before. Didn't even separate it before. Can I do it now on Yontif? No. If you could have done it before, and it would have made no difference, you could do it now. You can't do it now. If you didn't do it before Yontif, you can't do it now. The only reason now you're allowed to do the separation of the challah and the matanis on Yontif itself is because I couldn't do it before Yontif, because we say you have every right to fresh bread and freshly slaughtered meat. But if you'd already slaughtered it yesterday, you did it already yesterday before Yontif, and you didn't separate the parts before Yontif, then you can't separate it on Yontif. You should have done it before. If you could have done it before, you're supposed to do it before. So therefore, Beis Shammai took their concern this far in the sense that even if I was allowed to slaughter it and make the dough on Yontif, I was allowed to, and I was allowed to separate it. And now I can eat. I can't bring it to the Kohen. Because if I give it to the Kohen on that day, people might think that, oh, you gave it to the Kohen today? Then that means you could have separated it today under all circumstances. They're going to carry that idea of being able to separate today. They're not going to just say, oh, I can separate today because I did it today. They're going to think I can separate it today even if I could have separated it yesterday. And that's not true. And therefore, Beis Shammai say, no matter what, there is no giving to the Kohen, the challah, or the gifts. Even if you were able to separate it today, you cannot give it today. That is how everything boils down to the machlekes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai say that no matter what, the same way you can't give truma to the Kohen on Yontif, you cannot give the challah or the matanis to a Kohen on Yontif. The same way by truma we have concerns about what giving to the Kohen might make people think. I have that concern, says Beis Shammai, if I give the challah and the animal parts to the Kohen on Yontif. I have to be concerned of a mistake people might make. And Beis Hillel don't go that far. Beis Hillel say that being on the day itself, there is no problem. And on the day itself, we're not going to be concerned. We're not going to really be concerned. Apparently, according to Beis Hillel, that when you do it that day, to be concerned that people will think I could have done it even if it was ready to be done yesterday. Beis Hillel weren't concerned with that. And therefore, Beis Hillel say there's no question that on the day that you slaughtered or made the dough, you can give it to the Kohen. The same thing could happen even if you separated everything yesterday, could have given it to him yesterday, that we say, we're not going to be concerned and say, well, if I give him yesterday's, people will think I could separate yesterday's, but rather the same way you could do it from that day itself, you can do it from what was separated the day before, and there's no problem giving it to the Kohen. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Welcome.